Show you a document entitled Branch Organization, January 2015. Published in 2012 by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. And would I be right to understand that this is the current version of this manual?
Yes, January 2015.
Yes.
The date? Yeah.
Thank you. And this is the document that was produced in answer to my call earlier today.
That's correct.
And as coordinator of the Australia branch, I take it you're reasonably familiar with this manual?
Yes.
And I'd like to take you to some parts of it and then ask you some questions that follow. Starting with Chapter 1. Do you have Chapter 1, headed Governing Body and Governing Body Committees?
Do you have another copy of this document? We've only got one between us. Yes.
And in paragraph 1, it provides that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses is made up of brothers who are anointed servants of Jehovah God. They have the responsibility for giving direction and impetus to the kingdom work. And some scriptures are cited. And then it says, like its first century counterpart, the governing body today looks to Jehovah, the universal sovereign, and to Jesus Christ, the head of the congregation, for direction in all matters. Now, that's what it says. Is that the practice? Is that how it works?
That's correct.
Yes. And then you'll see in paragraph 2, the Bible says, let all things take place decently and by arrangement. The governing body obeys this direction by putting in place various helpful procedures and guidelines that ensure the smooth and orderly operation of the branch offices and the congregations. Responsible Christian men do their part by setting an example of obedience as they put such arrangements into effect. And in your experience, is that how it's worked in practice?
Yes.
And in paragraph 4, the governing body gives final approval for new publications as well as new audio and video programs. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as a consequence of that, that the branch office does not itself publish anything independently of the governing body?
No, but we do have writing desks. For example, the Australia branch, we have a writing desk. We have writers who prepare articles and submit those, and they get published in the Watchtower or Awake magazines.
So that's a process that's actually explained in a later chapter, so far as I was able to see, but that's a process whereby people within the branch would submit articles to the headquarters in New York, and those articles may be accepted for publication.
And get approved by the governing body for publication, yes.
Yes. And so is it the case then the governing body, as a body, would approve each of the publications published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania?
Yes.
So each Awake article and each Watchtower article we can take as having been approved by the governing body.
The governing body, as I understand, read every article before it's published and then give their approval for that.
Thank you. And then in paragraph 5 it says the governing body cares for the appointment and deletion of branch and country committee members and designates the brother who will serve as the coordinator of the committee. And then that's how it happens in practice, is it?
That's correct.
And so you were designated as coordinator under this provision.
That's right.
And it also appoints circuit overseers and country representatives. In most cases, such appointments are made based on recommendations received from the branch committee. The governing body also appoints helpers to governing body committees, as well as headquarters representatives qualified to make branch visits. I take it that's what's done in practice.
Yes.
And then over the page, if we see in paragraph 8, is the various committees of the governing body are identified, starting with the Coordinators Committee. Do you see that?
Yes.
In paragraph 8, this committee oversees legal matters and the use of the media when necessary to convey an accurate picture of our beliefs. It responds to disasters, outbreaks of persecution and other emergencies, and so on. And I take it the Coordinators Committee does actually exist and function, does it?
Yes.
Yes. And on the following page, do you see at paragraph 15, there's something called the Teaching Committee?
Yeah, paragraph 15, yes.
And it says this committee supervises the production of spiritual food that is delivered orally for the benefit of the worldwide brotherhood and supervises the format that is to be followed at congregation meetings. So am I to understand that correctly, that the teaching committee is responsible for what is taught orally around the world?
Yes, at the congregation meetings, conventions, assemblies.
Right, so it says, for example, it is directly involved in preparing talk outlines, convention costume dramas, and sound-only drama scripts and recordings, convention chairman's introductions, as well as audio and video publications that are distributed on DVD, posted on jw.org, or broadcast through other means, and so on. So that's all the responsibility of the teaching committee.
That's correct.
And then it's set out schematically, I think 2 pages further on, with under the heading World Headquarters, there's the governing body, and then the various committees of the governing body are identified. And amongst them are the Coordinators Committee on the left, the Writing Committee on the right, and the Teaching Committee next to that. And as far as you know, is that how it's actually structured?
Yes, that's how it operates.
And in Chapter 2 then, deals with the responsibility of branch committee members. In paragraph 1, it says the governing body appoints well-qualified elders to serve as members of the branch committee. I think you gave the evidence to that effect earlier in any event, so that happens in practice, does it?
Yes, that's correct.
And skipping one sentence, it says, as the representatives of the governing body in their assigned territory, branch committee members must faithfully implement and follow the direction coming from God's word and the faithful and discreet slave. Now, firstly, just to understand, the reference to the faithful and discreet slave, that's a reference to the governing body, am I right?
That's synonymous, yes.
Yes. And so are we to understand this, that the branch committee members must faithfully and implement and follow the direction given by the governing body?
Yes.
And in paragraph 3, you'll see each branch committee member should be able to give as well as to follow direction. He must keep up to date with the policies and direction from the governing body and help others in oversight of the branch office to do likewise. And I take it that at your branch office you try and do that.
We do, yes.
And in paragraph 4, branch committees also have the responsibility to keep the organisation clean. And there's a scriptural reference. They must be courageous in seeing to it that all unrepentant ones are removed from the congregation. And I take it you seek to fulfill that requirement, do you?
Yes, the branch committee doesn't actually do that unless they're an elder in a particular congregation that would handle be on a judicial committee, but they are responsible to ensure the procedures are in place in congregations, qualified elders to carry out that.
And they do that by that is the branch committee's oversight of the congregations.
Yes.
And if we then skip a page and we go to paragraph 16, we'll see branch committee coordinator. That's the position you hold, is that right?
That's correct.
And some aspects set out in relation to that. And I could then just take you to the coordinators committee, which is at chapter 3. If you can,
chapter 3.
Page 4 to chapter 3. The pages themselves are not numbered so far as I can see.
Yes.
So this is dealing with the coordinators committee of the branch committee. Do I understand that correctly?
No, this
I
is
beg your pardon. I meant of the
governing body.
The coordinators committee of the governing body.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. And paragraph 1 is introductory. Paragraph 2, it then sets out the branch committee's role, saying it should feel free to ask the governing body or one of its committees any question related to kingdom work in the territory under the oversight of the branch office. It is best that such questions be expressed clearly and carefully in writing rather than by telephone. So do I understand from that that the branch committee has questions with regard to any policy or procedure or scriptural interpretation? It has the ability to write and seek clarification?
That's correct, yes.
Yes. And is that procedure utilised in practice?
Yes.
And then you'll see, I won't go to the details, but in paragraph 5, it set out that desk symbols should be used. Mr. Spinks gave some evidence with regard to that. Paragraph 6, correspondence standards. We go over naming of files. And even in paragraph 14, in particular, I might identify, in addition to the use of numbered letters and memorandums, departments at headquarters and at the branch offices.
Sorry, I just missed where you are.
Paragraph 14, I'm sorry, Mr.
Okay,
Ryan.
yes.
You see headed email?
Yes.
And I'm just drawing attention to where it says that departments at headquarters and at the branch offices may be approved by oversight to use email to communicate directly with departments or individuals in other lands about technical and routine matters. However, email does not replace numbered letters or memorandums. So am I to understand that in practice certain people are approved to use email for these kinds of communications?
Yes, as I mentioned, routine matters. For example, our computer department assists other branches that don't have qualified personnel. So rather than use branch mail, they can communicate just by email because it's a routine matter.
Yes. So to summarise then, is it the case that this manual sets out the rules by which the Jehovah's Witness organisation internationally operates?
Yes, from the governing body and the branch. It's branch organisations, so it's direction for branch committees.
Yes. And right down to the details of who may communicate with whom and in what medium?
Yes, in fairly broad parameters. So the branch committee has the responsibility to decide who may, but the majority of the office workers use email to correspond.
And so when the branch, I beg your pardon, when the governing body gives a directive to the branch to deal with something in a particular way, this is the document which sets out the governing body's authority to do that and the branch's obligation to obey. Is that right?
Yes, in conjunction with the scriptures, with the scripture reference that was used twice there in Matthew chapter 24, verse 45 to 47, says that Jesus appointed the faithful and discreet slave to provide the spiritual food to the domestics, that's God's people. So on the basis of that scripture, that's the scripture reference for the whole procedure here.
And broadly it's believed to be modelled on first century Christendom as set out in the Book of Acts.
Book of Acts chapter 15 as an example.
Yes.
So there was a question on doctrine, and rather than the Apostle Paul making a decision on whether circumcision was a requirement for Christians was the issue, he took that back to the governing body of older men, the apostles and other older men in Jerusalem. They made the decision, and then they sent that decision by letter back with travelling representatives to the congregations, letting them know what the decision of the governing body was.
Mr. O'Brien, I've discussed this with other witnesses, but the Bible was, of course, written by people who lived a long time ago.
Yes.
And who lived in a particular political and social structure.
True, yes.
For example, slavery was still part of everyday life.
That's correct, yeah.
And as taking that as an instance, society generally, not everywhere, but society generally, and certainly in Western society, has moved on, where slavery is no longer permitted.
True. Yeah.
That's an illustration of social change.
Yes.
Right. Now, the learnings that you take from the Bible and then translate into obligations, as I presently understand it, in many instances, are learnings that were created in order to benefit and create a stable and healthy society more than 2,000 years ago.
Correct, yes.
Is it open to the Jehovah's Witnesses to take another look and ask the question whether what the Bible says was appropriate for those times remains the obligation of the 21st century?
So that's the issue with the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament and the Greek scriptures or the New Testament. That was a significant change in Bible law and Bible understanding, and much of the Christian era, from the recorded in the Greek scriptures or the New Testament, basically is principles rather than laws and commandments, although it does still contain some laws. But the Mosaic law that the nation of Israel had lived by, that was done away with Christ. And so the principles, we believe many of them are timeless in any place, any time.
Well, that's the question. That's your belief.
Yes.
And I was careful to say there are principles which you have accepted as obligations. And that's the position, isn't it?
Yes, that can be, yes.
But is it open to Jehovah's, as perhaps you've done with slavery? I mean, I assume that Jehovah's Witnesses would find slavery abhorrent.
Yes, yeah,
Right.
particularly that.
Whereas the New Testament accepts it.
It was a different type of slavery to what generally is like the African slavery that was taking place in those centuries, the settlement of the empires. The slavery back then was much more like an employed person.
Not the impression I have of Rome.
In the Christian era, in the household of Christians, it was that way. The Bible gives counsel to masters who had slaves, how they were to treat their slaves, not the way the Romans did.
They weren't exactly employees, though, were they?
No, but they were cared for. But they were different. Anyway, the point I'm making was different to the type of slavery people associate with, say, the African Americans.
Well, at the centre of the issues that the Commission is concerned with, of course, as you know, is the process whereby the Jehovah's Witnesses receive, investigate and determine allegations of sexual abuse.
Right.
You understand that?
Yes, I do, yes.
And you understand the discussion we've had about the difficulties that women might face in expressing their intimate concerns to three men in the tribunals that you've provided.
I do, and that's why I think Mr. Spinks made the point yesterday that just doesn't happen nowadays, that unless the woman wanted to face her accuser.
It's not the accuser, we're talking about the
adjudicator. Yeah. So if it's a matter of gathering evidence, the principle is that the elders who are going to investigate the matter simply need to be convinced that the statement or receive the statement from the victim. That can be done any number of ways. She doesn't have to sit and face three elders because there's no clear Bible principle that says that she must do that. So,
but nevertheless, she's disclosing her intimate details to three men.
Well, not necessarily, I think, Your Honour, but she can meet one elder, depending on the age of the person.
All right.
It's historical.
Ultimately, the adjudication process will require three men.
Three men, but she may not need to be involved after she's provided her statement.
After she's given the intimate details.
Yes.
Correct? Now, is there room for women to be involved in the investigation and decision-making process?
Well, that's one of the points we need to take back and discuss, give that much more consideration than we have, because that, if it's based upon the Bible standard, then we would present that to the governing body as one of the recommendations from the Commission. Well, certainly, I can see the point being made with it, and I don't see why a woman couldn't be involved in the process, particularly in establishing the victim's statement, so she doesn't have to face 3 men.
Now, as I understand it, the role of a woman in early Christian society was quite different to the role which women have in Western society today.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say that's true.
And the Bible, in identifying men as the leaders, and thus you've turned that into the elders, was reflecting the social structure that existed in those communities in those days, wasn't it?
It was.
Now, society has changed in the Western world and continues to change in relation to the role of women, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Now, why would it be that the Jehovah's Witnesses would stay with a structure that is reflected in a society of 2,000 years ago and not one that's a contemporary society today?
I think the fundamental issue, Your Honour, is whether or not we accept the Bible as being the Word of God, and God as the sovereign has the right to decide on those matters. So that's how we view the Bible. But we realise that society in general doesn't have that view.
No, but you've moved away from a number of the precepts of early Christian society. We discussed slavery, but I think yesterday I discussed with one of your colleagues the role of women in the church itself and their capacity to speak and so on. You probably heard that.
Yes, I heard the discussion. Yeah.
I mean, a number of things have been put to one side or have been changed.
Yes, so if a review of our process, which we'll take back, I'll take that definitely back to our branch committee and our service department personnel to just have another good look at the procedures, and if we can see a need to make some adjustments in that, that's what we would recommend to the governing body. There's no question on that.
So that, is it right to understand that if the evidence from this commission and the gathered expertise of professional people suggests that your process, by not involving women at the decision-making level, was a flawed process, would it be open to change?
I definitely think it is open to change. It always is. We've been reviewing the process for years, decades. So.
Specifically asking about the decision. Would it be open to change the composition of the decision-making body?
Of the Judicial Committee? Yeah, I can't see how it could, personally, but then I'm not the decision maker on that. That would be the governing body. But scripturally...
some things can change. For example, the role of women in the church and their capacity to speak. But whether or not women are decision makers can't change. Is that the idea?
As I understand it.
Now, why is that?
Well, because the scriptures are very clear that an overseer or an elder has to be a man. There's no provision in the scriptures for a woman to be an overseer. And it's the elders who are the shepherds and would judge in these matters. But I think that's dealing now at the situation of the judicial process with the wrongdoer, not with the victim. The earlier processes that we've been talking about and listening to, I think there's certainly scope there for women to be involved in those steps.
What you're looking at is a determination of whether or not the allegation is true.
That's correct.
And all that I'm asking is, leaving aside whatever might be the other role of men in the church, I don't go there, but why is it not open to say now, given that you, as Jehovah's Witnesses, have created this process with its investigation and determination steps, why is it not open to change that process to include men in, to include women in the decision-making component?
Well, it's probably a question that I'm not authorised to really give you a definite answer on, but certainly one that I'll be taking back to our branch committee and passing on to the governing body, because I can see the reasoning behind the suggestion, the recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I assume you would accept that women bring a different perspective and a different understanding to an issue such as whether or not a young girl or a woman was sexually assaulted than a man might bring.
Most definitely. Women have the motherly instincts that a man just can't have.
And what your process does at the moment is exclude them from the decision-making component altogether, doesn't it?
So when you refer to the decision-making,
the determination of whether or not the allegation is true.
Women could be involved in that step. So women could be involved in that step. So that's the point I was trying to make.
As decision-makers?
Well, she's listening to the comment. For example, a mother listens to her daughter.
No. We're talking about the processes which you have for determination and ultimately judicial determination of the truth of the allegation. Those processes at the moment exclude men. We've agreed on that. Exclude women.
Sorry, exclude women. No, I don't think so entirely, because women can be involved in that's talking about the investigation process.
I'm talking about the decision-making process.
Whether or not it is.
Whether or not it's true.
Yes. So I don't.
Women are presently excluded from that decision, are they not?
No, they could be involved in the discussions with the elders who've been investigating it. Like, there are many situations where women have perhaps been involved in talking to the victim, or maybe the victim's only comfortable to talk to a woman. She's sharing her observations with the elders. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing.
Well, I think I've exhausted my capacity to get to the real issue, but the real issue is whether the Church's processes will allow for women to participate
in the decision of whether it needs to be in the decision of matter or not, whether it needs to be a judicial matter or not. Guilt, establishing guilt.
The truth of the allegation.
Yes.
Mr. Brown, perhaps can we put like this, leaving the word involved out of it. On the present structure, a woman cannot be a decision. The allegation is on whether or not sufficiently proved. The allegation is.
She wouldn't be one of the two elders investigating. I could narrow it down to that.
So she cannot be the decision maker. And equally on the judicial committee, a woman cannot be a decision maker. A woman might be involved, giving evidence or whatever, but can't be a decision maker.
No.
And the question then is, do you see scope for that changing as to who the decision makers are and having a woman being a decision maker?
I certainly see scope in presenting that as an option to be explored more deeply than perhaps it has been up until now. Yes, definitely.
Mr. Brown, you've followed these proceedings closely over the last week and a half, I take it.
Yes.
And I sought to have a message conveyed to you yesterday evening. I hope you got it, and that's as to whether, having listened to it all, you have identified aspects of your process which seem to you to require re-examination and change.
Yes, I think a number of areas have come up for consideration that we need to now go back and look at much more carefully. One of them that I see is the matter of some clearer documentation for the ones who will be involved in handling investigations and judicial cases involving child sexual abuse I'm talking about. Maybe specific information just tailored to that, so that the elders would have much more at their fingertips in one package, the information they need. That's certainly one observation I'll be taking back. A second consideration would be that in the initial meetings with the victim, or the parents of the victim if it's a minor, that it's very clearly explained to them what the options are for them and what the implications are for either option, knowing that they'll have the full support of the elders, whatever is their decision.
And by options, you're referring to the possibility of reporting to the authorities?
Reporting to the authorities, or if they wanted it handled just within the church itself.
Yes.
Leaving them make the decision.
Yes.
So those are two factors that stand out significantly to me that we need to. And probably then in the process, the various steps that are taken from the initial discussion with the victim or the victim's parents, in case of a minor, each step of the way ensuring that the victim or the parents understand what the next step is going to be. So there's complete clarity in the mind of those, what the process is all about, because I think that is a weakness that's been identified that needs clarification.
Yes. And anything further you've identified?
I think they're probably the three major things. I do take on board the point of more involvement with women in the process, if that can be accommodated. I'm not in a position really to state whether that would be or would not be, but I can certainly take that as a matter on the agenda for consideration.
You would have heard quite a bit about the question of the sufficiency of evidence, in other words, what's been referred to as the two-witness rule. Firstly, from what you've heard and the way in which it operates, do you consider it to be justified?
Yes, again, because we accept that scriptural direction that did come from Christ himself, that we don't see we have authority to go outside of that. That's in establishing whether or not there will be a judicial committee to follow. It doesn't mean that we don't believe the victim or that we wouldn't take certain precautions and action where we can, but it just means that we don't have a basis to form a judicial committee at that point.
And insofar as the judicial committee itself is concerned, so not dealing with the step before that, what about on the question of whether the victim herself must give evidence in circumstances where there's no confession and no other witness, or no second other witness?
That she must give evidence. So
Yes.
maybe I just didn't quite understand the point of the question.
My understanding where things landed with Mr. Spinks yesterday was that when it comes to the judicial committee hearing itself, unless there's a confession or two other independent witnesses, it will be necessary for the victim herself to give evidence.
No, she would have been able to do that in a written statement. She wouldn't need to appear before the judicial committee or before the accused.
Well, what about the requirement that the victim must face her attacker?
No,
As it's put differently, that the accused has a right to be faced by his accuser?
I think the information that's been presented from the shepherding book indicates that that's not necessarily the case. Not even limiting it to child abuse, it says even if the victim is timid, they may not feel capable to face the accused. If that's the case, the elders would quite happily accept a written statement.
Well, we'll go back to what Mr. Spinks said himself in the documents that he referred to and then was tendered as 29-20. But do I understand from you that you accept that an appropriate process would not require the victim to give evidence in the face of her attacker or her alleged attacker?
Definitely not. If she felt she wasn't able to do that, that wouldn't be a requirement. In fact, she'd only be required to do it if she wanted to.
Yes, and with regard to the possible outcomes of a judicial committee hearing, reproval, of course, leaves a known offender in the congregation and in the family if the offender's in a family, not so.
Yes.
And disfellowshipping leaves a known offender in the family and or at large in the community.
That's true.
And both those problems can only be resolved with systematic reporting to the authorities. Would you agree?
Yes, well, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily remove the person, as I understand, from the community. If they were imprisoned, it would, but once they're released, you still face the same dilemma that we do, that the person's free in the community.
Well, you may be aware, Mr. O'Brien, that in New South Wales, at least, there's legislation that deals with that question of serious sex offenders coming to the end of their terms in jail, and as to assessments then being made as to whether they should be released. And there's a complicated process involving many professionals and reports and so on. Are you aware of that?
Yes. Well, the challenge that I see with the process for ourselves as a religious organisation and also with the judiciary is that there's a wide range of acts that constitute child abuse. Like to us, an adult sexting with a minor, we would regard that as child abuse and they would be dealt with judicially.
So would the law.
Right. But would they receive the same type of penalty as, say, somebody who raped a child? That's what I'm just saying. That's
obviously not, or presumably not, but that would be up to the particular court. But
Certainly.
my point is this, Mr. O'Brien, is that you, as the Jehovah's Witness organisation, don't have the power to intervene in a family in such a way as to ensure protection of children. You can give advice and counsel, but you can't really do more than that, can you?
No, that's correct. Yeah, we can't take over.
Child protection authorities in certain circumstances can.
Yes.
Yes. And so would you at least accept this, that it warrants further consideration by the Jehovah's Witness organisation as to whether they should systematically report child sexual abuse allegations?
I understand, listening to Mr. Toole and Mr. Spinks, that we have no hesitation in doing that if that's what's required by the law, but we don't see that we have the right to take that prerogative away from the victim or the parents of the victim if they chose not to.
And that's because of a scriptural principle?
Yes. That's right.
Now, with regard to redress, by which I mean responding to and potentially compensating victims of child sexual abuse within the organisation, I understand that in Australia the Jehovah's Witness organisation doesn't have a redress scheme.
No, and that's because we've never had a request so far for redress, so we haven't.
Well, you recognise it may be that there's been no request for redress because no scheme has been available.
I couldn't say why victims haven't requested that.
Yes,
so
all I'm suggesting is that it may not be a good reason to not have a scheme because there've been no claims. It may be that a scheme will be the very thing that gives comfort to a lot of people that their allegations are taken seriously and that they actually get compensated.
yes, certainly.
Is that not something that the Jehovah's Witness organisation should consider, having a redress scheme?
Yes, agree with that.
Because if we consider BCB's case as an example...
Just a second. You know that the Commission has been looking at the issue of redress, don't you?
I do, yes.
And it's fairly clear that the Commission will be recommending a response which brings together all of the institutions where there may have been problems to contribute their fair share. You understand that?
I recall that from the closed hearing we had with
The
you.
Jehovah's Witnesses prepared to contribute to such a scheme?
I'm not in a position to personally give that undertaking, Your Honour, but certainly
Who is?
we'd present that and discuss that.
Who is?
Well, that would be a decision, if it's the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, then that would be a decision for the 26 members. I don't have executive powers over the committee or the members, but I can certainly present that because I can see that that is a need that needs to be considered.
Would you recommend that the church join in such a scheme?
I don't know whether I would recommend that the church join in with other organisations, but certainly that we have some redress scheme of our own to care for victims who are Jehovah's Witnesses. I'd agree with that.
Why wouldn't you recommend that you join with others so that there's a uniform response across the country?
If I may just indulge on, Your Honour, when we had the closed meeting with yourself and others, that was a matter that I think was almost universally felt as a last option by those who were assembled for a variety of reasons. I think some may feel that would it be fair on smaller organisations and unfair on unfair on smaller ones, fairer on the larger ones to manage it. I would see it as a much greater difficulty than for the individual organisation to provide their own scheme.
You must have a different recollection to me. But the theory would be that there be an organisation constituted to administer the scheme, and then each organisation contributes in accordance with its identified number and extent of survivor needs. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand the principle you mentioned.
And why wouldn't you join in that?
Well, again, I can't say that we would or wouldn't.
Sorry, why wouldn't you recommend that you join in that?
Well, I'd have to give it good consideration to recommend it, but I wouldn't rule out that we wouldn't consider that or that I wouldn't recommend that. But we'd have to see what the parameters were, what the considerations were for the organisation.
Well, the matter's been now talked about for months. Your organisation considered it in any structured way?
No.
We've had discussion papers, we've had roundtables,
No,
we've had public hearings.
Yeah, the round table discussion, I came away from that without any real conclusions. I felt maybe I didn't get the right message from it, but I didn't feel that it was a universally agreed to option, and I haven't read or heard any more about it since, to be honest.
All right.
Just on the question of joining any form of scheme and a decision in relation to that, you said that would be a decision of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and the 21 members. Why would that be so? Why not the Jehovah's Witness organisation itself, separate from one of the corporations that it uses?
Well, the challenge would be if it's an unincorporated group, an association of people, providing the funding, I would see as a major difficulty for victims who have a just and fair claim.
Well, just dealing with the decision making on it, the decision would have to be made by the governing body, wouldn't it?
As far as providing redress?
Yes, well, as far as having a redress scheme, or insofar as of joining some other scheme along the lines that His Honour was engaging you about with other organisations.
Yes, it would have to be presented to the governing body for approval, but we would have to provide the scheme for victims within Australia. The governing body wouldn't be taking that into their consideration.
Because the corporation you were referring to is the Australian corporation.
The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia.
And that's an instrument of the Jehovah's Witness organisation itself, not so?
It is, and it's the one that can legally handle financial matters, whereas Jehovah's Witnesses themselves, or the branch committee.
And you as the church organisation, use that corporation to your ends, not so?
Yeah, for a variety of reasons.
And so it must do what you say it must do.
Sorry, I just missed that.
So it must do what you say it must do, not you personally, but you, the organisation.
Yeah, what the members approve. It's true, it still is a legal organisation that has to have membership approval.
Yes, but you couldn't conceive of a situation of the members of the organisation doing something other than what the branch committee was happy for them to do.
That's true, and I think it's because the branch committee wouldn't recommend something that we didn't feel was proper.
So it's a bit artificial, isn't it, to say, well, it's up to the 21 members of the corporation when the corporation is actually and factually under the control of the branch committee?
No, I don't think so, because the branch committee, as I mentioned before, is 12 people who would have to discuss this and provide that then, and most of the branch committee are members of the Watchtower Bold and Track Society in any case.
Yes, well, that probably illustrates the point. But moving on, Mr. O'Brien, Mr. Jeffrey Jackson, who's a member of the governing body, as I understand, he heads the teaching committee, is that right?
He's a member of two committees. My understanding is that each of the governing body members are members of two committees. I understand he is a member of the writing committee and the teaching committee.
Yes. Well, I have to say my information as of September 2014 also puts him as a member of the personnel committee.
Well, that's different to my understanding.
Well, we'll leave personnel out of it for a moment. So, but Mr. Jackson is, I'm not sure what the designation is, whether it's coordinator or chair or responsible for, but he's in effect the head or responsible for the teaching committee, isn't he?
No, I don't think the chairman is simply the similar role of being a coordinator of the branch committee. Is that he just coordinates the work of that committee, but doesn't have like executive authority over the committee.
Yes, no, very well. That's what I'm getting at. So he's the coordinator of the teaching committee.
I don't know. I know he's a member of the teaching committee and of the writing committee.
Yes.
But his actual function, I don't know.
And the teaching committee has the responsibilities set out in the branch organisation manual that we were looking at a few minutes ago. Is that right?
Yes, the role that is mentioned there.
And that includes what will be taught in the various Kingdom of Ministry schools and a whole plethora of other means by which publishers around the world are taught about your word. Is that right?
Some of the schools would be the responsibility of the service committee. If it's schools for elders and travelling overseas, the service committee would care for
And Shepherd the Flock of God is the guiding textbook which would guide also the activities of the teaching committee.
I think that would be probably something approved by the entire governing body, but perhaps coming more from the service committee because it's service related.
And I understand that you've not served as a member of the governing body, so I'm asking you from what your understanding is. But your understanding is that the 7 members of the governing body as a governing body meets weekly, does it, every Wednesday?
Yes, so those who are present meet weekly.
Yes. And it'll be that governing body as a whole, or those who are present, who would authorise the various publications and guides and guidelines and so on, is that right?
They would give the final approval for the publishing of them, yes.
Now, you will have heard yesterday that senior counsel representing the Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia and the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia said that Mr. Jackson would not be likely to be able to assist this commission because his role is in the translation of matters. Now, that you accept as a clear variance to what you've explained in your evidence?
No, Sorry, it's not. The translation, it comes under the writing committee, as I understand, which is what Mr Jackson is a member of. So.
Yes, but he's also the coordinator of the teaching committee that has many other responsibilities and not translation, not so.
Yeah, as a member of the governing body, he has
Yes,
a number.
Can you explain, Mr O'Brien, how it came about that senior counsel representing your organisation was given instructions that Mr Jackson's role is confined to the translation matters when it clearly is not?
His role, as I understand, is principally translation, but translation is part of the writing committee. As a governing body member, he has numerous functions to perform, not just as a translator.
Yes, indeed, and as a consequence of those numerous functions, he would have knowledge across a whole scope of activity of the governing body, not so?
I guess he would have...
Far beyond translations.
Yes, yeah, more than translation.
Mr O'Brien, did you give those instructions to senior counsel?
The instructions regarding Mr Jackson? Yes.
It led me to believe that there was little that Mr Jackson could add to the discussion. And no doubt that's what you expected would happen. Is that right?
That's true, and I still concur with that.
Well, I'm starting to form a totally different impression, I have to tell you.
Well, if I could explain that Mr Jackson, his two principal roles, as far as I understand in the governing body, are with the writing and the other committee. The two committees I've mentioned, the writing, and part of that involves translation. Mr Jackson was in the Pacific Islands for many years, understood many of the Pacific Island languages, helped...
Well, I understand that he may have a role in translation, but I'm now coming to understand he has a significant role in relation to teaching, but also the general affairs of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
He wouldn't have involvement in matters to do with the Coordinators Committee, which handles legal, nor with the Service Committee, which handles service matters.
But he sits at the top with others in relation to all of those committees, doesn't he?
No, different governing body members are assigned specifically to different committees.
I understand that, but nevertheless, the governing body, I assume, has the ultimate say in all things.
When things come back to them as a governing body, yes.
And he's a member of that.
Yes, he's a member of the governing body.
He's here in Australia.
He's with his father. Well, I understand he's still in Australia. I don't talk with Mr Jackson, but I understand his father is gravely ill, very close to death, and that's why he's here, to be with his father.
Yes.
Mr Brown, how many editions of Watchtower and Awake are published each year?
The Watchtower and Awake, in their public editions, are published monthly. There's also a study edition of the Watchtower, which is used in congregation meetings, that's also published monthly.
And what other publications are regular periodicals to congregations, that congregations would get?
We have a monthly item called the Kingdom Ministry, which sets out the schedule for our midweek meetings. And then annually there are also released books or brochures. There's a yearbook published every year.
And how many articles are there generally in a Watchtower magazine?
In the public edition, well, there's 16 pages, so depending on the size of the article, maybe 6.
And Awake?
Awake would be similar.
16 pages.
And the study edition of the Watchtower is 32 pages.
And now, as I understand it, some publications or articles are specifically identified for group study by congregations during the course of the month.
Yeah, that's specifically the Watchtower study edition.
So is it the whole of the study edition will be studied through the course of the month?
Yes, or in pursuing months. So the November issue, for example, may not be studied until January, February.
Yes.
So there'll be 4 or 5 study articles in that which would cover 1 month.
Yes. And now, with regard to the guide to publishers, the baptismal guide, you're familiar with the one I'm referring to? I may be using the wrong terminology.
Organised to accomplish our ministry.
Now, that is issued, as I understand it, when someone is baptised. Is that right?
No, prior to that, when a person qualifies to share in the public preaching work, that's with the congregation, that's when they can obtain a copy.
And then they have, as it were, a personal copy.
They do.
And they treasure it up, take it.
Yes, yeah, well, that's then the book they use to review the questions for their baptism afterwards.
And then when a new edition is published, maybe 10 years later, do they then get a copy of the new edition and use that? Does it replace the earlier one? Or?
Yes. Yeah, everyone in the congregations would receive the new updated copy.
And the old ones are discarded or filed away for historical purposes.
Whatever they wish to do with it.
Not regarded as current.
No.
Okay, thank you. Now, in Australia, I understand from your statement that there are 821 congregations, is that right?
That's right.
And there are 68,000 active members.
That's correct.
And if my arithmetic has not let me down, that would give an average congregation size of 83.
I guess on average, but some are much larger, some smaller.
Yes. And congregants, as I understand it, tend to know each other and associate closely with one another. Is that right?
It's true, yes.
And would it be true that amongst the Jehovah's Witness faith in Australia, there's a strong sense of community?
Yes, I think that's very true. We probably refer to one another as brothers and sisters.
Yes, and the congregation members gather to worship with each other twice a week and spend much of their social time in each other's company?
Yes, twice a week are congregation meetings. We probably also meet together again on a different occasion to share in our preaching activity, and maybe at other times too.
And they meet up to 3 times each year with larger groups at gatherings such as assemblies and conventions where friendships continue to be maintained and strengthened. Would that be right?
It'll be 3 times. We have twice a year we have a 1-day, what we call an assembly, circuit assembly, and once in the year we'll have a 3-day convention.
And as a faith, each member is genuinely concerned with the welfare of their fellow brothers and sisters as they refer to each other. That would be right.
That's correct.
And as one article, I think, describes it, would you accept this, that the congregations are essentially a collection of overlapping families?
Overlapping families and individuals, not all. Like I'm the only person in my family, but now I've married my wife. But prior to that, I was the only member of my family who's a Jehovah's Witness.
And so for a Jehovah's Witness, his or her social network is amongst other Jehovah's Witnesses.
I'd say generally that would be the case, yes.
So now I want to put to you a scenario. If you take a victim of sexual abuse in a congregation where her attacker is in the congregation and she reports that to the elders, and they cannot act judicially because there's not sufficient evidence. Take that scenario. Now that can happen, I think we've established
yes.
over the last 10 days. And now take the scenario that she feels silenced and unhappy with the organisation's response as a consequence of that. Do you see that?
Yes. Yep.
And she cannot bear to be in the same organisation as her abuser and have to see him or face him. And as a consequence, she decides to leave the Jehovah's Witness organisation. Do you follow the scenario?
Yes, got it.
Now, to do that, in other words, to leave, she must dissociate from the organisation. That's right, isn't it?
No.
Well, if she leaves, otherwise she would in any event be regarded as an apostate.
No. If I could explain to correct your thinking on that, if a person, for whatever reason, wishes to attend a different congregation, they're at liberty to. A person's not bound to be in any particular congregation at any time. If, for personal reasons, they decided they no longer wanted to attend any congregation, to stop associating with Jehovah's Witnesses, they would be viewed as just an inactive witness, and they are free to resume their activity anytime they wish. If a person wants to take the step of actually disassociating themselves, wanting to be known no longer as one of Jehovah's Witnesses and have that known to the congregation, that would be a step they would take, and we would try to assist them if there was some way we could help them remain in the faith. But if they're adamant, then that would be their decision. But that's what's disassociation.
Yes, well, let's take the scenario where this woman feels so silenced and unhappy in the organisation as a consequence of what I set out. She decides to disassociate. And that then means, as it's put in the manual, making known a firm decision to no longer be one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Is that right?
That's right. That's disassociation, yes.
Yes. And as I understand it, the same consequences then flow insofar as how she's treated by the remaining congregants to if she had been disfellowshipped.
So that's because she has made that decision, not because the congregation has. A person who's disfellowshipped is disfellowshipped by the congregation for whatever actions that disqualified them. A person who disassociates himself, they personally decide on that action, knowing that the consequences of disassociation mean that they will be cutting themselves off from the congregation, not
Yes.
the other.
Yes, indeed. But you see in the scenario that I've painted for you that this person's feeling is so deep that she wishes to disassociate from the congregation. Now, the consequence of that is that those, as it said, in the truth, being Jehovah's Witnesses, are not allowed to associate with the disassociated person. That's right.
That's true, but it's because of the person's decision. If they just remained inactive, if they just wanted to not be coming along to the meetings, then they can still have free spiritual association with any of Jehovah's people.
Yes, well, I'm dealing with the scenario, as you well appreciate, where this person, because of the way in which her abuse occurred and allegation was dealt with, she wishes to disassociate.
Okay.
And the consequence of that is that those who remain are not allowed to fraternise or converse with the disassociated person, not so.
I agree, yes.
Mr. O'Brien, what happens in the situation? Well, I'll go back a step. Do the elders of a particular congregation accept an obligation to care for the safety of those in that congregation?
Yes, that's why they are shepherds, to care for the flock of God.
And if an allegation is made by a woman that she's been sexually abused, which the elders, or at least the Judicial Committee, or those investigating, accept is true, but there's not a second witness.
Yes.
In that situation, the elders would be continuing to accept the abuser as a member of that congregation, notwithstanding that they knew that he had sexually abused, wouldn't they?
Yes.
How is that reconciled with any obligation they have to care for the safety of those in that congregation?
Well, then, I think it was explained by Mr. Spinks that in that situation, the elders would meet with the alleged abuser, even though it can't be proven, they would still have taken the victim's accusations to him or her, and then as a result of that would give very clear direction on what restrictions would apply to their association with children, with others in the congregation, and they would monitor that.
And would others in the congregation know that that person had those restrictions placed on them?
No.
That means that supervision is confined to when the elders or an elder is present and observes the abuser.
That's true, but if it was reported to the elders, it came to their attention that the person was in violation of the restrictions, well then the elders would take firmer action. The person could even be disfellowshipped if they disregarded.
That's dependent upon the elder observing or
being reported.
Well, how's it going to be reported if the others don't know to report it?
Well, perhaps, yeah, I can't say. I don't know.
Well, it wouldn't happen, would it?
No.
Do you think that's a proper discharge of the obligation you say they accept to care for the safety of that congregation?
Well, again, it's governed by that scriptural command or requirement that elders are not authorised to go beyond that, of let the matter be established at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, so that they can take whatever care they feel is necessary to try to protect the congregation. But beyond that, unless there's a second witness to a similar type of event or the same, then the elders' hands are tied with warning the person. And
I'll take you to tab 120, that's Shepherd the Flock of God, at page 115. It's Ringtail 116. You can see in paragraph 5, this chapter 10 is headed Matters Related to Disfellowshipped and Disassociated Ones. And then you'll see in paragraph 5 it says disfellowshipped and disassociated ones are generally expected to make their own arrangements for transportation to and from congregation meetings. However, in some instances, a disfellowshipped or disassociated individual who is making a determined effort to regain a right standing with Jehovah may be in a situation that prevents him from obtaining transportation. It may be that he has no car and that family members or others are not able to help him. Perhaps he cannot afford public transportation or it is not available in his area. It may be that the distance involved, personal safety or severe weather makes it inadvisable to walk. In such cases of desperate need, the elders can determine whether some assistance may be provided. Such assistance would be viewed as similar to public transportation, in that there should be no fraternizing or conversing with the disfellowshipped or disassociated person. So that's the principle, isn't it? No conversing or fraternizing with the disassociated person.
that's correct, yes.
And then in the next paragraph, if members of the congregation are known to have undue association with disfellowshipped or disassociated relatives who are not in the household, elders should counsel and reason with those members of the congregation from the scriptures. So the position is that if a disassociated person is in the same household as a Jehovah's Witness on everyday matters in the household, there can be that association. But if they're not in the same household, the same rules apply as if they were not in the same family.
Yes, so with disfellowshipping and disassociation, if they live in the same household, then it's understood that it's referring then to spiritual association. Obviously, if it's a husband or wife or child or mother or father, of necessity there has to be conversation. But it's the spiritual association that would now be restricted.
But if they're not in the same household, then social association is also restricted.
Yeah, kept to a minimum at least.
Yes. And you see there's then a reference there, review with them information from God's Love book, pages 207 and 208. I'd like to take you to that. Part of this document is already in the tender bundle, but not this part.
Thank you.
And so we to understand that these pages here, 207 and 208, are the guidance that's being referred to at what we were looking at a moment before. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you'll see halfway down page 207, starting on the right-hand side, it says, the Watchtower of September 15, 1981, page 25, stated, a simple hello.
Sorry, I've just missed where you are. Oh, you're in the paragraph 2.
Yes, halfway down the page.
Yes, okay.
The Watchtower in 1981 stated, a simple hello to someone can be the first step that develops into a conversation and maybe even a friendship. Would we want to take that first step with a disfellowshipped person? Now, we to understand that is applying also to a disassociated person, aren't we?
Yes.
Is strict avoidance really necessary? The question's asked, yes, for several reasons. First, it is a matter of loyalty to God and His Word. We obey Jehovah not only when it is convenient, but also when doing so presents real challenges. Love for God moves us to obey all of His commandments, and so on. And at the foot of the next page, 208, starting the second line from the bottom, you'll see it says, loyal Christian family members do not look for excuses to have dealings with a disfellowshipped relative. Now that applies also to a disassociated relative, not living at home.
Yes.
Rather, loyalty to Jehovah and His organization moves them to uphold the scriptural arrangement of disfellowshipping. Their loyal course has the best interests of the wrongdoer at heart and may help them to benefit from the distance received. And indeed, there are other publications that set out these forms of principle, aren't there?
That's true, yes, that's an understanding I have.
Yes. Now, the consequence in the scenario that I put to you is that this survivor of abuse who wishes to leave the organization is put to a choice, isn't she? She either stays in the organization or she leaves and thereby potentially loses her whole family, or much of it, depending on how many remain in the witnesses, and her social network.
No, I think there's that other option that you missed there is by just ceasing her activity in the congregation.
Well, I'm presupposing, Mr. O'Brien, that her feeling is sufficiently intense that she wishes to disassociate from the organisation.
Yes, so then she would appreciate the implication of that.
Yes, and her friends and family would face the implication too that they would have to disassociate from her.
Yes.
It's an impossible choice, isn't it? I mean, no one, is it not right, Mr. O'Brien, should be put to the choice of remaining in an organisation which she feels is protective of her abuser and losing her family and social network.
Well, I can only be guided by what the scriptures say on that.
Well, do you accept that it's psychologically devastating and cruel?
The whole purpose of disfellowshipping or disassociation is to help the person see the benefits of associating. So a disassociated person, a disfellowshipped person, is free to come back. A disassociated person particularly, they don't have to go through a lengthy procedure to come back, whereas a disfellowshipped person has to prove their repentance suitably.
Well, it makes your organisation a captive organisation, doesn't it?
I don't follow what you mean by that.
Well, it makes it incredibly hard for someone to leave because of the huge pain, suffering, cruelty that she must face if she does leave.
I don't believe so.
Do you appreciate, Mr. O'Brien, that this point of shunning, as it's called, is the one that probably makes people the most angry around the world amongst the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses?
But if it's disassociation, again, it's a choice they make. They don't have to disassociate themselves to stop associating. They don't lose their spiritual or
I can see
familial association by being inactive.
I can see you might get some support for it by the manner in which first century Christians organized themselves. But is it justified in today's world and today's morality to treat people in this way?
Well, personally, what is accepted as today's morality in many ways, I wouldn't say is acceptable to a Christian.
Your Honour, I attended the branch organisation January 2015.
Well, before you do that, I'll mark the Keep Yourself in God Love document extracts. It's 29-27.
Your Honour, I wonder if I might be heard just briefly on the tender. I've taken on board what Your Honour said.
On the branch organisation.
Yes, Your Honour. I wonder if Your Honour would be so good as just to accept the pages that have been referred to, but to still keep confidential those matters that have not been referred to. There's no public interest in those matters that have not been referred to. There's no purpose to be so.
I haven't read the whole document. I don't know.
No. Well, Your Honour, I imagine that if they were relevant, my learned friend counsel assisting would have taken Mr. O'Brien to those matters. The concern is simply that they are confidential to branch committee members. They're not for general distribution within the branch itself. We would seek to maintain their
Are you telling me that members of the church don't know the rules that govern that church?
Your Honour, I suspect that they do, in the sense that they're probably told them, but the document itself is confidential. I can understand.
But if they know, then protecting it now is a little late, isn't it?
Well, Your Honour, not really, Your Honour. It's to protect that which is regarded as confidential within the organisation, and on the other hand, there is no public interest in members outside.
Well, I don't know about that because I haven't read the whole document, but I can understand that the bits that we've discussed so far fit into the context of the whole document. Look, I think you'd have to persuade me that there was any particular section that, by reason of the content, needed to be kept confidential before I'd take that step. You realise that Royal Commissions, by convention, work in public, and
Yes,
the public has a right to know
Yes, Your Honour.
what it is we're looking at, and in relation to the organisation for which you appear, how that organisation is structured and managed to deal with these sorts of problems.
Yes, Your Honour.
The rules of the organisation are obviously important.
Your Honour, and I don't argue against those parts which are relevant to the matters the Commission has to determine being made public. It's those parts which have not been referred to at all and which would not be of any assistance to the Commission, which I seek to protect.
Well, at the moment that doesn't help me because I haven't read the whole document,
No.
and you haven't given me any content beyond the fact that they haven't been referred to, and therefore they shouldn't be.
Understood, Your Honour. If Your Honour would be so good as to give us the opportunity to put a brief submission in writing, which Your Honour can then consider at Your Honour's leisure, if Your Honour rules against me on that point, then so be it. Of course, we'd accept the ruling, but if Your Honour would give us that opportunity, I'd be grateful.
Mr. Stewart?
Well, Your Honour, I would certainly resist any restriction on the document for two reasons. First, I too haven't had the opportunity to consider the whole of the document, so I'm not sure what other aspects are necessary.
Should we leave it on the basis Mr. Tockley puts it, that we'll keep what hasn't been referred to confidential at this stage, subject to him persuading us with a written submission?
I'm content to deal with it on that basis with some
Well,
time
then-
frame. You know.
Well then, I'll make the document Exhibit 29-28. And in terms of what's been referred to, if I look at the index, and I seem to have a page missing, there must be a...
Chapters 1, 2 and 3 were referred to, Your Honour.
1, 2 and 3. I would have thought, and any of you have to be relevant. Tockley, would that be right?
Yes, Your Honour.
So what about, and I haven't looked at the content, what about
Chapters 7 and
5 and 7?
Yes, 5 and 7.
Mr. Tockley?
Your Honour, I can't see how 5 or 7 would assist in the sense that, by the looks of it, for example, under 5, it deals with accounting matters, allowances,
Well, its
auditing.
heading is Publishing Committee, which I assume means the publication of educational and other material.
I think, Your Honour, it deals with the financial aspects of such matters.
I don't know.
No, that's why I seek the permission.
What about 7?
7 is in relation to organisational matters. 7 may be relevant to Your Honour's purposes, and I don't seek to argue against that.
What about 8?
I'd have to review 8, Your Honour, to make
Well,
sure.
what I'll
that's
do at
not-
the moment is I'll allow publication of chapters 1, 2, 3 and 7, and if you can give me and the Commissioner a submission tomorrow, I'll rule in chambers in relation to the matter on Friday.
Thank you, Your Honour.
So the document, the whole document is 29, 28, but I order that the chapters other than 1, 2, 3 and 7 at this stage not be published. Yes.
I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honour.
Anyone else? Any questions?
Thank you.
Yes?
Yes, thank you.
Ms. David?
Thank you. Mr O'Brien, my name is David, Ms David, and I appear on behalf of BCG in these proceedings. Just one area of concern that, in my view, has been highlighted through these proceedings, and that is the manner in which the scriptures are used to assist a victim. I want us to, of course, it's accepted that it is an important part of the healing process.
Particularly spiritually, yes.
Spiritually, yes. Again, I want to emphasise that I would think that you would agree that the Commission proceedings highlight the need for a comprehensive approach, including spiritual, that must have psychological or other care given to the particular person abused, so not just spiritual guidance.
True, yes, agree.
What concerns me, and I don't mean any of this as a criticism, but what concerns me is the way in which sometimes the scriptures have been used. For example, in the case of BCG, she has given evidence that she doesn't recall, in her particular case, receiving any scriptural guidance other than that she was essentially told in a letter from head office to keep her tears in a bottle. And that particular document is Tender Bundle 30, and perhaps if that can be brought up, please. This was in response to a very long and rather a letter from a clearly distressed victim of abuse, in which she talked about the fact that she had been essentially, had a life sentence by reason of the abuse on her, and she spoke about her sister. She was clearly distressed. I won't repeat all the distress, but it's obvious. But in the response, she was essentially told, if you would agree, in paragraph 2 of that letter, firstly, she was told, always throw your burden on Jehovah. And then she was told that the heart-warming prayer of David is appropriate, where he entreated Jehovah to preserve his tears in his skin bottle. Now, it's clear from her evidence that the manner in which she understood that was to silence her, to bottle it up. So what I'm asking you is how you see the organisation perhaps addressing how those scriptures are ministered to ensure that victims don't improperly internalise a bit of scripture to the point where they believe they have to bottle their pain. for example, as in this case?
Yes, so if that's how she interpreted it, it's a shame because it on ones who have a need. And so we could maybe write and ask Circuit Overseers to specifically ask if there are victims of abuse in the congregation to make that a definite arrangement if the person wanted to do that, and then ensure proper scriptures are used to console and comfort.
And would you see a benefit of perhaps consulting with an expert professional in the area of dealing with the victims of abuse to ensure that, to look at a more comprehensive approach of ministering those scriptures?
I think the point was made here at the Commission that there are Jehovah's Witnesses, probably men and women, who have expertise in psychology and psychiatry, and I can see definite value in consulting them on what they may suggest could be incorporated by elders who don't have that type of experience when they are shepherding victims such as BCG and others.
Right, thank you. Just another question, just on the issue of the Watchtower. The Watchtower is studied. I think you said that there is an edition that is the subject of study meetings.
It's true, yes.
If, for example, a person is not at that meeting or not a member of the congregation at the time that particular Watchtower is being considered, how would they ever know what was in it?
We have a provision that's available to every member of the congregation that was provided to the Commission here. It's called the Watchtower Library on CD. Every year that's updated with the latest publications. And in referencing that, it provides 2 indexes of publications going back many years, and all a person with even very basic computer knowledge would need to type in child abuse, comfort, whatever word, and that would bring up every article where that particular point is discussed. So the average witness is very familiar with that. We also have an online program, Watchtower Online, which has publications going back, Watchtower and Awake publications from the year 2000 to present, and the same research tool is there. Do a search on any word and it will bring up the publications that discuss that.
And to ensure a consistency of approach by elders dealing with this issue in the congregation, do you advise them that they must have regard to all those publications?
Yeah, the elders certainly are reminded each visit almost with the circuit overseer, when he meets with the body of elders, he will talk to them about the needs of shepherding. I know I'm an elder in the congregation in addition to my other responsibilities, and there hardly would be a visit on a 6-monthly basis where we're not given encouragement on our shepherding role in the congregation.
And just coming back to, well, just looking at it from the perspective of prevention, again, a person within the congregation, the general, the publisher or anybody that's baptised, would not necessarily be minded to go to read these publications, would they, about child abuse, unless there was a fairly consistent and continual reminder? Is there any process to ensure that there is an ongoing education and prevention program directed at the members of the congregation?
I think if you visited the jw.org site, currently in the broadcasting program for this month, there's one each month, there's a little video animated clip of parents helping their children to know how to defend themselves from abuse.
Okay. And that is this month. I guess what I'm asking you, what is the process to ensure that this is consistent from month to month, from day to day?
Well, there are so many issues confronting families and Jehovah's Witnesses, like the rest of the community, that we don't just focus on any one, obviously, each month. But from time to time, articles are published. There's a publication particularly designed for parents. I think, again, that was provided to the Commission, where the parents can discuss the story with their child.
Yes.
And one of them covers protecting themselves from abuse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr O'Brien, my name is Miss McGlinchey and I appear for Monty Baker in these proceedings.
Thank you.
Mr O'Brien, I just want to be clear on circumstances which will lead to a matter of sexual abuse being reported to the police, and it may be best for me to put a scenario to you and you can perhaps answer some questions on that scenario. So the scenario that I want to suggest is that a complaint comes to you of an abuse, of a sexual abuse of a child, and the abuser is the child's father, and the child remains at risk.
Okay.
Do you report the matter to the police?
In that scenario?
Yes.
The report, so there are a couple of issues in the scenario I'd have to clear. It was reported to me by the child, do you mean, or by?
By any source at all?
Well, if it was by the mother, I would presume, generally, then we would, I think as Mr Toole brought out earlier, we would ask the mother what she was doing to make sure the child was now protected from any further abuse. If she felt incapable of doing that.
The assumption that the child remains at risk.
Yeah, so if the child remains at risk and there's no responsible adult within the family to remove it from the further risk of abuse,
yes,
then we would report that to the police.
Have you ever done that?
No, I've never had need. I've never been, I think I mentioned in my submission that the only time I've had any involvement with child abuse was when I was a circuit overseer and was simply reporting the matter to the branch office so that it could be followed up by the congregation.
So you've never come across a situation like that personally?
No, never.
Right. Do you, in your knowledge of the church, have you ever heard of anybody else reporting a matter to the police? A matter of child sexual abuse?
Yeah, no, I haven't personally, but again, my area of responsibility within the branch committee doesn't deal with child abuse matters generally, but for the Royal Commission, I've taken the interest in it as a member of the branch committee and a director of Watchtower Society too.
And in the interest you've taken in it, just to be clear, you haven't come across or heard of any instances of a report to the police?
No, but that doesn't mean I haven't heard that it's not happening either.
All right. Now, Mr Bryan, just moving on, the Jehovah's Witnesses has a legal branch.
A legal branch?
Yes.
We have a legal department in the branch, yes.
I'm sorry. And that branch includes 2 practising solicitors. That's Mr O'Toole and Miss Van Whitson.
Yeah, Mr Toole. department. Not all do, because not all have solicitors. Sometimes it might be an adjunct to the service department. But if there is a legal department within the branch, then we do rely on legal advice. But the legal department itself may outsource advice, which has happened on a number of issues that we've faced.
All right. Okay. Mr. O'Brien, I just want to take you very briefly back to a matter that there's been considerable questions in the Commission, and that is the role of women in the church. And I want to just see if you can help me understand some of the spiritual and scriptural underpinnings of the role of the women, what women can do and what they can't. Okay? Now, do you, would you understand that 1 Timothy does provide guidance on that issue?
Yes, that's the scripture that was discussed yesterday regarding the role of women in the congregation.
It might have partly been discussed yesterday, yes. You familiar with that scripture?
I think you'd have to remind me of the specific verse.
All right. Perhaps if I could read it to you. It's not very long.
No, it's okay. If you just give me the reference.
1 Timothy 2, 11 to 12.
Yes. Yes. If you have it in front of you, but for the benefit of everybody else, I'll just read it.
Sure.
Okay. Let a woman learn in silence and with full submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Also, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was thoroughly deceived and came into transgression. However, she will be kept safe through childbearing, providing they continue in their faith and love and sanctification, along with soundness of mind. Is that a correct reading? Do you agree?
Yes, yeah, that's what the scripture says.
All right. I think that it's fairly clear that there's very firm directions that a woman can't teach, correct?
In the congregation, yes.
Yes. And a woman is not permitted to have authority over a man. Mm-hmm. And
A baptised member of the congregation, yes.
All right. And is that one of the reasons why women can't be elders?
One of the reasons is in that same chapter, if you look at chapter 3, it lists the qualifications of an elder.
Yes.
And it says, for example, in verse 1, if a man is reaching out. Verse 2, needs to be a husband. Verse 4, a man presiding over his household.
I understand that, and we did go through those yesterday.
Yes,
but can we just deal with 1 Timothy 2? Because I want to ask you, well, firstly, do you agree that this is authority for why a woman can't be an elder?
Because of the fact that that's what the scriptures designate. We don't feel we have authority beyond scriptures on that point.
And this scripture says that a woman cannot exercise authority over a man. Part of the role of an elder is to take such positions such as a judicial member.
That's true.
Which would lead her into a situation where she may be required to have authority over a man.
If she was an elder, you mean?
And that's prohibited.
Yes.
All right. Now, do you agree that if you read on in Timothy, it sets out some of the reasons for those directions? And that firstly, it was because Adam was formed first and then Eve. Do you agree?
So yes.
All right. And it goes on to say, also, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was thoroughly deceived and came to be in transgression. Now, what do you understand that to mean?
Well, you'd need to go back to the Genesis account, Genesis chapter 3.
Well,
can I
just ask you, what do you think that sentence means?
I believe it means what, as I said, the Genesis account of creation and the fall into sin, where Eve was deceived by the serpent, Satan, into thinking she could eat the fruit and not suffer any consequences. So she was deceived. The man was more culpable because when she showed him the fruit and said what she'd eaten, he wasn't deceived. He just simply was disobedient. And that's why the sin in the Bible is charged to Adam, not to Eve.
Because women are more able to be deceived, therefore less culpable.
No, I don't think women are more able to be deceived.
Do you agree that a reading of that sentence may suggest that men have natural attributes that better equip them to be in positions of responsibility?
No, all I read into it is that this is how God has ordained his arrangement, and
Yes.
I accept that.
Do you agree that it does suggest that women do not have perhaps the intelligence to exercise responsibility because Eve was thoroughly deceived and Adam wasn't?
I think mankind, referring to the masculine gender, have been deceived equally, as have women. Just Eve, in this particular instance that I was looking at, Eve was the one who was deceived by Satan, not Adam.
Yes.
He was more culpable because he was willfully disobedient. She was deceived. At least that's something to her credit.
And in this context, that is Timothy, the scripture is setting out why a woman can't have authority over a man.
No, I think that the following verses in the qualifications for a person to be an elder nominates and specifies it needs to be a man.
Right.
Not because a woman is deficient in her ability or intelligence, or we don't believe that for a minute.
Do you believe that a woman has natural abilities equal to that of a man?
In many respects, she has qualities and abilities that a man doesn't have.
And do you believe that women have equal intelligence to men?
Certainly.
That's generally held to be true in the Jehovah's Witnesses?
Definitely, yes.
All right. And do you believe that women have equal qualities in terms of other skills or attributes such as wisdom and the ability to look at evidence fairly?
If I could just labour the point for a moment to answer that.
I would like you to answer my question.
I'll answer it.
Yes.
But
okay.
the formation of the Christian congregation in the beginning by Jesus Christ, he selected the 12 apostles. He didn't set them up to be a governing body or a body of elders or a congregation. He sent them out to preach by twos. Later on, he sent 70 others to preach. The entire book of Acts shows that the purpose of the Christian congregation is to preach the good news of the kingdom. Men and women do that equally as well, many women far more effective as preachers than are men. So to assume that we would feel, as Jehovah's Witnesses, that women are in some way deficient to men, we don't think that for a moment. We love and respect the women who are taking this good news of the kingdom into the field.
Mr. O'Brien, it's not just a coincidence that women are not in positions of responsibility in Jehovah's Witnesses, is it?
Not a
It's
coincidence.
not just a coincidence.
No, it's scripturally based. Is that what you mean? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
yes, I do. So, are you saying to me that despite the fact that the church believes that women are capable, women are intelligent, women have wisdom and judgment, that they will still never be elders in your church?
As long as that's God's word, that's how we would have to view it, yes.
Mr. O'Brien, I discussed this yesterday with other people, but if you look at verses 11 and 12,
Chapter
2,
yes.
let a woman learn in silence with full submissiveness. Does the church apply that?
Sorry, I missed that question.
The words are, let a woman learn in silence with full submissiveness. Does the church apply that injunction today?
Yes, as far as, if you go back in context in verse 8 and 9, it's talking there about men carrying on prayer in the congregation, so it's not just in her home. So in the congregation setting, the women are not assigned to teach.
Well, no more than that. Are they to learn in silence?
We understand women free to comment at our meetings, but under the direction and oversight of a man, one of the elders who's a teacher. He can invite a woman to comment on point, but he is the one doing the teaching.
So you don't apply that in those terms?
Not literally that she can't speak in the congregation meeting.
It goes on. I do not permit a woman to teach. Do you apply that?
Yes, so the woman doesn't teach in the congregation. That's the context of the chapter here.
Or to exercise authority over a man, but she is to remain silent.
Yes.
Do you apply that?
Yes, in the context of the congregation, again, not in her home or in the general preaching work, which is not a congregation teaching. And that's why...
women do teach, they just can't teach in the congregation. Is that the idea?
That's the point, yes.
Very well.
I don't have anything further, Your Honour. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
Your
you.
Honour, do you have any questions? Mr. Chocolate?
No, Your Honour, thank you.
Very well. Mr. Stewart?
Your Honour, there is a matter that, in fairness, I must put to Mr. O'Brien. Mr. O'Brien, you've given evidence that you gave instructions to counsel on the point of Mr. Jackson not being able to assist and his activities being with relation to translations. And I, as a matter of fairness, must put to you that those instructions you gave were false, were they not?
No, I don't believe so. Mr. Jackson does oversee the translation work, but as part of the writing committee member, which he is one of the governing body members on that committee. So,
and I suggest to you, I put to you, that when you gave those instructions, you knew them to be false.
no, I disagree.
And by giving those instructions, you sought to mislead the Royal Commission to protect Mr. Jackson from any potential summons to appear.
No, I disagree. I think the reason we asked consideration to be shown to Mr. Jackson was the grave situation of his father, the very reason he's in Australia.
Yes, well, and in relation to that, in view of what I've put to you, perhaps you can answer this. How are we to know if what you say about Mr. Jackson's compassionate circumstances is in fact true?
We could provide an affidavit if you wish. We could provide doctors' reports on his father, whatever the Royal Commission would like. I'm sure we can arrange for that.
How long has he been in Australia?
I'm not sure, Your Honour, but I think maybe a week or two, a couple of weeks perhaps.
He's been here since before the 14th of July, hasn't he?
Yeah, I don't know specifically. I could find out, but I don't know exactly when he arrived. But it's only within the last couple of weeks.
I have nothing further.
Yes, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. That concludes your evidence. You're excused.
Thank you very much.
Your Honour, I do have some documents to tender. They're arranged individually, so I'll just tender them one by one, if I may. The first...
How many documents are there?
5, Your Honour.
Right.
We're going to give them to you in a little bundle, Your Honour, all 5 of them.
So do I mark them together or mark them separately?
No, mark them separately if you would, Your Honour.
We've just identified them and I'll give them a number. You can step down, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you.
So the first is an email of 16 July from Milton Bray to the Royal Commission setting out Jehovah's Witness membership statistics.
That'll be document, that'll be exhibit 29. 29. Yes.
The second is a revised version of the notes of the investigating committee. And, Your Honour, this in fact is not perhaps the best way of dealing with this is not a new tender, but it's to replace the existing.
I'll mark it separately.
All right, as Your Honour pleases. So it's the notes of the investigating committee taken by Mr. Ally.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Your Honour, it's the typed transcription of the note, Mr. Ally's notes of
I
investigating.
can see that. Yep.
The third is the results of the Watchtower case file analysis summary prepared by Royal Commission staff. And if I can explain, because this has passed between my learned friends for the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and those assisting me over the last several weeks, we've removed from the spreadsheet all the names of people and also all the congregations. So what's left is the raw data in case there's any debate about the summary analysis and submissions. And I tender that.
That'll be 2931.
And then there is extracts from Organised to Accomplish Our Ministry 1983.
That'll be 2932.
And extracts from Pay Attention to Yourselves and to All the Flock 1991.
That'll be 2933. Yes.
That's all I have. A standard order for submissions. Your
Well,
Honour.
before I come to that, Mr. Tockley, I'm not at the moment. I'm troubled by what I now understand as to the role of Mr. McDonald in the organisation. And it does seem that, having regard to the issues we've canvassed, he would be able to help. Do you want to respond to that?
Your Honour, I can respond. I can certainly try and take further instructions for reasons that are obvious. I think that Your Honour is entitled to whatever assistance should be provided to Your Honour. My understanding remains, as I was instructed, that in relation to these legal matters, Mr. Jackson would be of no assistance.
It's not legal matters that the discussion has moved a little from the history to the future.
Yes.
And at the moment, I can presently understand the injunction that's felt in relation to elders.
Yes, Your Honour.
But a deliberative process for the church, it's possible to imagine it being one which was not entirely conducted by elders. But secondly, a process which the church engages in because of its adherence to the Bible, which allows a person those who are deciding the matter have no doubt has committed abuse to nevertheless remain in the community, raises other issues as well.
Yes, Your Honour.
And they won't have eluded you or Mr. Coyne as they were raised.
No, Your Honour.
I mean, if you put yourself in a position to care for other people and you fail, then consequences flow. Now, these are issues which clearly have emerged from our discussion, and we would like as much help as we can. And as he's in the country, it would seem logical that we ask him to come and help us.
I understand Your Honour's point, and I'm not seeking to not address Your Honour's point.
No, I understand that. And having said that, I appreciate the circumstances of his father, but we all have to face those difficulties from time to time in our lives.
Yes, Your Honour.
What I'm going to say is I would like you to take up the matter with Mr. Stewart, and we'll make arrangements sometime next week to hear evidence from Mr. McDonald, unless sorry,
Jackson.
Oh, Jackson. I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson. Unless Mr. Stewart comes to me and says that that can't be done.
I understand, Your Honour.
All right. Now, secondly, beyond that, Mr. Stewart has, I haven't seen it, but a standard form of directions for submissions. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honour.
Has that been agreed between everyone?
I'm not sure that it's been agreed. I did canvass it with some, but we have a 4-week for submissions from our side and 4-week from other interested parties. So it's a fairly
Standard.
period of time.
Unless anyone says otherwise, I'll make those directions. But can I say this to, I suppose, Mr. Tockley, it's to you again, I'm sorry.
Your Honour. No, not at all, Your Honour.
But it will be quite apparent now that some of the documentation of your clients just doesn't fit either the practice or what they accept should be the position. And what we'd like from you is a draft of the revisions which you proffer as appropriate, having regard to the discussion that's taken place.
Yeah. I understand why Your Honour would say that. I'm not seeking to avoid assisting the Commission or to assist Your Honour. I think that the process that may be contemplated, though, in light of what's fallen during the last 2 weeks, is for there to be a review of the procedures, but also at the same time for those procedures to be considered by professional persons, such as, for example, a psychiatrist or psychologist or a professionally trained counsellor, to ensure that any proposed revision would not result in further trauma being caused.
That may be a course that obviously has attraction.
Yes, Your Honour.
But the starting point is to identify where you or your client accepts the problems are.
Yes, Your Honour.
And some of those are blatantly obvious from the words, not according to the practice. And then moving on from there, what steps your client might take
Yes, Your Honour.
to bring its processes and its documentation up to an appropriate position,
Yes, Your Honour.
which may include consultation with professional people,
Yes, Your Honour.
which is what's happened in other organisations we've looked at. For example, the YMCA have conducted a complete review with the help of professional people.
Yes, Your Honour.
And we would be looking for you to proffer to us what your client accepts would be the appropriate course to take, and then we can have a look at it.
Yes,
If
Your
we
Honour.
don't agree, we'll say so. If we think it should go further, we'll say that as well.
Thank you.
But the starting point is to understand what your client accepts should happen.
Yes, no, I understood, Your Honour. I anticipate that a part of our submissions will be devoted to the matters Your Honour has raised with me, and it'll probably set out the steps that will be involved as well in dealing with that aspect of the matter.
And what we will then do, we live for another 2.5 years, we'll come back to you and we'll expect to be told what's happened.
I don't know about that, Your Honour. No,
Well, we'll do that. There's no doubt. There's no doubt we'll do that.
I suppose what I was saying was I wouldn't have thought that such a process would take 2.5 years. That's what
I don't know. I hope it doesn't.
One hopes so, Your Honour.
But we'll come back to you within the 2.5 years, as we're doing with other organisations, to ask your client, what have you done?
Yes, certainly, Your Honour.
And we'll expect that process to occur in public.
Thank you, Your Honour.
All right.
Yes. Your Honour, just before my learned friend rises, Your Honour, I can assure Your Honour that there was no intention, obviously, on my part to mislead Your Honour in any way.
We accept that.
Thank you, Your Honour. Your Honour, the other aspect of it is that, if I may it may be necessary for my learned friend Mr. Stewart and I to perhaps approach Your Honour in relation to Mr. Jackson's medical condition, simply because of the privacy of the matter, and to inform Your Honour.
Well, it's the medical condition of his father.
Yes, Your Honour. Yes,
as I understand it.
It is, Your Honour, yes.
And at the moment, that's all I know.
No, that's I understand.
And that's not enough for me now, given what I know about his role in the organisation,
Understood, Your Honour.
to say that we shouldn't have the benefit of his understanding.
No, well, I think I'll endeavour to obtain a consultant specialist report on the matter.
That won't actually necessarily solve the problem.
I understand, Your Honour. Understand.
I mean, it's regrettable, and I appreciate his position, but we all have to face these issues as well as our other responsibilities. And this Royal Commission, of course, carries great responsibilities for many, many people,
No, understood.
and some of whom are members of his church.
Yes, no, it's understood, Your Honour. Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes.
I might hand up the direction with regard to these submissions. It's self-explanatory, I believe. If there's to be any appreciable delay on the matters Your Honour has been discussing with my learned friend, then you might approach Your Honour with regard to an amendment of the direction.
Yes, well, we'll face that when we come to it if we need to. But otherwise, I've made the directions in those terms. Mr. Topley, feel free to approach Mr. Stewart if that's necessary.
Thank you, Your Honour. The only other...
The expectation we have is that at an appropriate time next week there'll be maybe 1 or 2 hours set aside.
Understood, Your Honour.
Yeah.
The only other thing, Your Honour, is Dr. Applewhite's supplementary report. Does Your Honour require that to be incorporated into the orders? Your Honour mentioned 2 weeks.
2 weeks is what I said. I think that's plain.
Yes, Your Honour.
Are we going to get one?
Yes, Your Honour.
All right, well then we look forward to it.
Your Honour, can it be 2 weeks from today? Simply
You're
because...
asking for an extension?
Well, Your Honour, if I may please,
You
Your
can
Honour.
have 2 weeks, or she can have 2 weeks from today.
Thank you, Your Honour.
All right, but no more.
Understood, Your Honour. Thank you.
Nothing further from our side. Your Honour.
Very well. Well, we thank everyone for your assistance, and it may be necessary for us to resume again next week, but people will be notified in due course.
Thank you.
Otherwise, we'll adjourn.
Show you a document entitled Branch Organisation, January 2015. Published in 2012 by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania, and would I be right to understand that this is the current version of this manual?
Yes, January 2015.
Yes.
The date? Yeah.
Thank you. And this is the document that was produced in answer to my call earlier today.
That's correct.
And as coordinator of the Australia branch, I take it you're reasonably familiar with this manual?
Yes.
And I'd like to take you to some parts of it and then ask you some questions that follow. Starting with Chapter 1. Do you have Chapter 1, headed Governing Body and Governing Body Committee?
Do you have another copy of this document? We've only got one between us. Yes.
And in paragraph 1, it provides that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses is made up of brothers who are anointed servants of Jehovah God. They have the responsibility for giving direction and impetus to the kingdom work. And some scriptures are cited. And then it says, like its first century counterpart, the governing body today looks to Jehovah, the universal sovereign, and to Jesus Christ, the head of the congregation, for direction in all matters. Now, that's what it says. Is that the practice? Is that how it works?
That's correct.
Yes. And then you'll see in paragraph 2, the Bible says, let all things take place decently and by arrangement. The governing body obeys this direction by putting in place various helpful procedures and guidelines that ensure the smooth and orderly operation of the branch offices and the congregations. Responsible Christian men do their part by setting an example of obedience as they put such arrangements into effect. And in your experience, is that how it's worked in practice?
Yes.
And in paragraph 4, the governing body gives final approval for new publications as well as new audio and video programs. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as a consequence of that, that the branch office does not itself publish anything independently of the governing body?
No, but we do have writing desks. For example, the Australia branch, we have a writing desk. We have writers who prepare articles and submit those, and they get published in the Watchtower or Awake magazines.
So that's a process that's actually explained in a later chapter, so far as I was able to see, but that's a process whereby people within the branch would submit articles to the headquarters in New York, and those articles may be accepted for publication.
And get approved by the governing body for publication, yes.
Yes. And so is it the case then the governing body, as a body, would approve each of the publications published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania?
Yes.
So each Awake article and each Watchtower article we can take as having been approved by the governing body.
The governing body, as I understand, read every article before it's published and then give their approval for that.
Thank you. And then in paragraph 5 it says the governing body cares for the appointment and deletion of branch and country committee members and designates the brother who will serve as the coordinator of the committee. And then that's how it happens in practice, is it?
That's correct.
And so you were designated as coordinator under this provision.
That's right.
And it also appoints circuit overseers and country representatives. In most cases, such appointments are made based on recommendations received from the branch committee. The governing body also appoints helpers to governing body committees as well as headquarters representatives qualified to make branch.
To the governing body of older men, the apostles and other older men in Jerusalem, they made the decision, and then they sent that decision by letter back with travelling representatives to the congregations, letting them know what the decision of the governing body was.
Mr. O'Brien, I've discussed this with other witnesses, but the Bible was, of course, written by people who lived a long time ago.
Yes.
And who lived in a particular political and social structure.
True, yes.
For example, slavery was still part of everyday life.
That's correct, yeah.
And as taking that as an instance, society generally, not everywhere, but society generally, and certainly in Western society, has moved on where slavery is no longer permitted.
True. Yeah.
And that's an illustration of social change.
Yes.
Now, the learnings that you take from the Bible and then translate into obligations, as I presently understand it, in many instances, are learnings that were created in order to benefit and create a stable and healthy society more than 2,000 years ago.
Correct, yes.
Is it open to the Jehovah's Witnesses to take another look and ask the question whether what the Bible says was appropriate for those times remains the obligation of the 21st century?
So that's the issue with the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament and the Greek scriptures or the New Testament. That was a significant change in Bible law and Bible understanding, and much of the Christian era, from the recorded in the Greek scriptures or the New Testament, basically is principles rather than laws and commandments, although it does still contain some laws. But the Mosaic law that the nation of Israel had lived by, that was done away with Christ. And so the principles, we believe many of them are timeless in any place, any time.
Well, that's the question. That's your belief.
Yes.
And I was careful to say there are principles which you have accepted as obligations. And that's the position, isn't it?
Yes, that can be, yes.
But is it open to Jehovah's, as perhaps you've done with slavery? I mean, I assume that Jehovah's Witnesses would find slavery abhorrent.
Yes, yeah,
Right.
particularly that.
Whereas the New Testament accepts it.
It was a different type of slavery to what generally is like the African slavery that was taking place in those centuries, the settlement of the empires. The slavery back then was much more like an employed person.
Not the impression I have of Rome.
In the the Christian era, in the household of Christians, it was that way. The Bible gives counsel to masters who had slaves how they were to treat their slaves, not the way the Romans did.
They weren't exactly employees, though, were they?
No, but they were cared for. But they were different. Anyway, the point I'm making was different to the type of slavery people associate with, say, the African Americans.
Well, at the centre of the issues that the Commission is concerned with, of course, as you know, is the process whereby the Jehovah's Witnesses receive, investigate and determine allegations of sexual abuse.
Right.
You understand that?
Yes, I do, yes.
And you understand the discussion we've had about the difficulties that women might face in expressing their intimate concerns to three men in the tribunals that you've provided.
I do, and that's why I think Mr. Spinks made the point yesterday that just doesn't happen nowadays, that unless the woman wanted to face her accuser.
Branch visits, I take it that's what's done in practice.
Yes.
And then over the page, if we see in paragraph 8, is the various committees of the governing body are identified, starting with the coordinators committee. Do you see that?
Yes.
In paragraph 8, this committee oversees legal matters and the use of the media when necessary to convey an accurate picture of our beliefs. It responds to disasters, outbreaks of persecution and other emergencies, and so on. And I take it the coordinators committee does actually exist and function, does it?
Yes.
Yes. And on the following page, do you see at paragraph 15, there's something called the teaching committee?
Yeah, paragraph 15, yes.
And it says this committee supervises the production of spiritual food that is delivered orally for the benefit of the worldwide brotherhood and supervises the format that is to be followed at congregation meetings. So am I to understand that correctly, that the teaching committee is responsible for what is taught orally around the world?
Yes, at the congregation meetings, conventions, assemblies.
Right, so it says, for example, it is directly involved in preparing talk outlines, convention costume dramas, and sound-only drama scripts and recordings, convention chairman's introductions, as well as audio and video publications that are distributed on DVD, posted on jw.org, or broadcast through other means, and so on. So that's all the responsibility of the teaching committee.
That's correct.
And then it's set out schematically, I think 2 pages further on, with under the heading World Headquarters, there's the governing body, and then the various committees of the governing body are identified. And amongst them are the coordinators committee on the left, the writing committee on the right, and the teaching committee next to that. And as far as you know, is that how it's actually structured?
Yes, that's how it operates.
And in chapter 2 then deals with the responsibility of branch committee members. In paragraph 1, it says the governing body appoints well-qualified elders to serve as members of the branch committee. I think you gave that evidence to that effect earlier in any event, so that happens in practice, does it?
Yes, that's correct.
And skipping one sentence, it says, as the representatives of the governing body in their assigned territory, branch committee members must faithfully implement and follow the direction coming from God's word and the faithful and discreet slave. Now, firstly, just to understand, the reference to the faithful and discreet slave, that's a reference to the governing body, am I right?
That's synonymous, yes.
Yes. And so are we to understand this, that the branch committee members must faithfully and implement and follow the direction given by the governing body?
Yes.
And in paragraph 3, you'll see each branch committee member should be able to give as well as to follow direction. He must keep up to date with the policies and direction from the governing body and help others in oversight of the branch office to do likewise. And I take it that at your branch office you try and do that.
We do, yes.
And in paragraph 4, branch committees also have the responsibility to keep the organisation clean. And there's a scriptural reference. They must be courageous in seeing to it that all unrepentant ones are removed from the congregation. And I take it you seek to fulfil that requirement, do you?
Yes, the branch committee doesn't actually do that unless they're an elder in a particular congregation that would be on a judicial committee, but they are responsible to ensure the procedures are in place in congregations, qualified elders to carry out that.
And they do that by that is the branch committee's oversight of the congregations.
Yes.
And if we then skip a page and we go to paragraph 16, we'll see branch committee coordinator. That's the position you hold, is that right?
That's correct.
It's not the accuser, we're talking about the
abuser,
adjudicator.
Yeah. So if it's a matter of gathering evidence, the principle is that the elders who are going to investigate the matter simply need to be convinced that the statement or receive the statement from the victim. That can be done any number of ways. She doesn't have to sit and face 3 elders because there's no clear Bible principle that says that she must do that. So,
but nevertheless, she's disclosing her intimate details to 3 men.
well, not necessarily, I think, Your Honour, but she can meet one elder, depending on the age of the person.
All right.
Historical.
Ultimately, the adjudication process will require 3 men.
3 men, but she may not need to be involved after she's provided her statement.
After she's given the intimate details.
Yes.
Correct? Now, is there room for women to be involved in the investigation and decision-making process?
Well, that's one of the points we need to take back and discuss, give that much more consideration than we have, because that, if it's based upon the Bible standard, then we would present that to the governing body as one of the recommendations from the Commission. Well, certainly, I can see the point being made with it, and I don't see why a woman couldn't be involved in the process, particularly in establishing the victim's statement, so she doesn't have to face 3 men.
Now, as I understand it, the role of a woman in early Christian society was quite different to the role which women have in Western society today.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say that's true.
And the Bible, in identifying men as the leaders, and thus you've turned that into the elders, was reflecting the social structure that existed in those communities in those days, wasn't it?
It was.
Now, society has changed in the Western world and continues to change in relation to the role of women, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Now, why would it be that the Jehovah's Witnesses would stay with a structure that is reflected in a society of 2,000 years ago and not one that's a contemporary society today?
I think the fundamental issue, Your Honour, is whether or not we accept the Bible as being the Word of God, and God as the sovereign has the right to decide on those matters. So that's how we view the Bible. But we realise that society in general doesn't have that view.
No, but you've moved away from a number of the precepts of early Christian society. We discussed slavery, but I think yesterday I discussed with one of your colleagues the role of women in the church itself and their capacity to speak and so on. You probably heard that.
Yes, I heard the discussion. Yeah.
I mean, a number of things have been put to one side or have been changed.
Yes, so if a review of our process, which we'll take back, I'll take that definitely back to our branch committee and our service department personnel to just have another good look at the procedures, and if we can see a need to make some adjustments in that, that's what we would recommend to the governing body. There's no question on that.
So that, is it right to understand that if the evidence from this commission and the gathered expertise of professional people suggests that your process, by not involving women at the decision-making level, was a flawed process, would it be open to change?
I definitely think it is open to change. It always is. We've been reviewing the process for years, decades. So.
I'm specifically asking about the decision. Would it be open to change the composition of the decision-making body?
Of the Judicial Committee? Yeah, I can't see how it could, personally, but then I'm not the decision maker on that. That would be the governing body. But scripturally...
some things...
In relation to that. And I could then just take you to the Coordinators Committee, which is at Chapter 3. If you can...
Chapter 3?
Page 4 to Chapter 3. The pages themselves are not numbered so far as I can see.
Yes.
So this is dealing with the Coordinators Committee of the Branch Committee. Do I understand that correctly?
No, this is...
I beg your pardon, I meant of the
governing body.
The Coordinators Committee of the governing body.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. And paragraph 1 is introductory. Paragraph 2, it then sets out the branch committee's role, saying it should feel free to ask the governing body or one of its committees any question related to kingdom work in the territory under the oversight of the branch office. It is best that such questions be expressed clearly and carefully in writing rather than by telephone. So do I understand from that that if the branch committee has questions with regard to any policy or procedure or scriptural interpretation, it has the ability to write and seek clarification?
That's correct, yes.
Yes. And is that procedure utilised in practice?
Yes.
And then you'll see, I won't go to the details, but in paragraph 5, it set out that desk symbols should be used. Mr. Spinks gave some evidence with regard to that. Paragraph 6, correspondence standards. We go over naming of files. And even in paragraph 14, in particular, I might identify, in addition to the use of numbered letters and memorandums, departments at headquarters and at the branch offices.
Sorry, I just missed where you are.
Paragraph 14, I'm sorry, Mr.
Okay, yes.
You see headed email?
Yes.
And I'm just drawing attention to where it says that departments at headquarters and at the branch offices may be approved by oversight to use email to communicate directly with departments or individuals in other lands about technical and routine matters. However, email does not replace numbered letters or memorandums. So am I to understand that in practice certain people are approved to use email for these kinds of communications?
Yes, as I mentioned, routine matters. For example, our computer department assists other branches that don't have qualified personnel. So rather than use branch mail, they can communicate just by email because it's a routine matter.
Yes. So to summarise then, is it the case that this manual sets out the rules by which the Jehovah's Witness organisation internationally operates?
Yes, from the governing body and the branch. It's branch organisations, so it's direction for branch committees.
Yes. And right down to the details of who may communicate with whom and in what medium? Yes,
in fairly broad parameters. So the branch committee has a responsibility to decide. who may, but the majority of the office workers use email to correspond.
And so when the branch, I beg your pardon, when the governing body gives a directive to the branch to deal with something in a particular way, this is the document which sets out the governing body's authority to do that and the branch's obligation to obey. Is that right?
Yes, in conjunction with the scriptures, with the scripture reference that was used twice there in Matthew chapter 24, verse 45 to 47, says that Jesus appointed the faithful and discreet slave to provide the spiritual food to the domestics, that's God's people. So on the basis of that scripture, that's the scripture reference for the whole procedure here.
And broadly it's believed to be modelled on first century Christendom as set out in the Book of Acts.
Book of Acts chapter 15 as an example.
Yes.
So there was a question on doctrine, and rather than the Apostle Paul making a decision on whether circumcision was a requirement for Christians was the issue, he took that back